I'm Joe Lombardo. I'm the coordinator of UNAC, the United National Anti-War Coalition. UNAC, as probably most people know, is a coalition of anti-war groups in the United States. You could find us online at unacpeace.org. We're also on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. And we are an anti-war coalition that considers ourselves an anti-imperialist coalition. We focus on the US government, which is our government, but is also the primary imperialist power in the world. Not only does it control financial institutions that control countries all around the world, such as the IMF and the World Bank, but and sanctions many countries, about 43 right now, if they don't abide by the US wishes, but they have military throughout the world, perhaps in 172 countries was a figure I saw recently. They have about 20 times the number of foreign military bases as all other countries in the world combined. The country with the second highest number of military bases is Britain, our NATO partner. The country with the third highest number of foreign military bases is France, another one of our NATO partners. So the US and NATO are the main military footprint around the world, and this is why we put our focus on them. Tonight's webinar is going to be on Ukraine with Scott Ritter, who you've heard before on some of our webinars, and I'm sure you've heard many other places because he's someone that has been listened to a lot for his analysis during this period. And I will introduce him in a minute, but first I'm going to introduce the other person on here, and I'm going to change the view so you'll really just see the speaker from now on rather than all three of us until we get to questions at the end, and maybe we'll come back. But the other person on the webinar here today is Wyatt Miller. Wyatt is also a member of the UNAC Administrative Committee. He is from Minneapolis, where he worked anti-war committee of Minneapolis, which has been a real mainstay in the anti-war movement for a number of years, and in UNAC has been a consistent builder and built coalitions with all the anti-war groups in the area, and has stayed strong when it's been really hard for the anti-war movement during this period. So I'm going to change the view so you'll just see the speaker view, and I'm going to introduce Wyatt, who's going to talk to you a little bit about the actions, the protests that UNAC has called for the middle of October. Wyatt, you're up.
All right, thanks, Joe. Thanks everybody for tuning in. So yeah, before Scott and Joe get into it, I just wanted to plug the week of action that UNAC has called for the week of October 15th through the 22nd. And that is under the banner of Back to the Streets, Say No to US Wars. So we are encouraging groups around the United States, as well as the rest of the world, to hold actions, whether that's a bannering, a rally, a forum, a teach-in, whatever your local organization is capable of doing to have a mass coordinated mobilization against the wars and conflicts that are fueled by the United States around the world. And a large number of groups have already signed on. We have an action planned here in Minneapolis for October 15th. There's going to be actions in New York City, Los Angeles, Baltimore, Chicago, and then also a large number of smaller cities have also planned actions. So we really encourage groups to put something together if you're interested. You know, maybe you're a smaller group. It's you don't need a lot of people to do a bannering. You know, if you haven't done that sort of thing before, you can get in touch with us and we can help put that together, or help tell you how to set something like that up. And the real focus, we see the real purpose here has been the anti-war movement has not mobilized on a large scale like this for some time. And part of that is a result of the pandemic. So we're hoping people will get mobilizing again. And then, of course, I think we have to acknowledge that the anti-war movement right in this period is under attack in a way that we have to contend with. And it's not just under attack by, like certain groups have been targeted by the FBI, but I think it's under attack sort of ideologically, in the sense that what the warmongers, the imperialists are really trying to push right now is the idea that the United States has a role to play in the world with its military and with its economic might to sort of be the arbiter of the world. And the anti-war movement has to stand up to that and say no to U.S. wars, say no to fueling conflicts with weapons, with arms shipments. And we're talking about Ukraine today, but maybe you have a group that is focused on Palestine solidarity or on Philippine solidarity, whatever anti-war issue you might be working on, organize an action the week of October 15th through the 22nd. Let UNAC know about it, and we can send a message to the people, American people, and to the world that ordinary folks in the United States, in the belly of the beast, are against these wars, and that we can actually fight back, stand up and fight back in the streets where we're most visible against the imperialism of our government. So that's all I got.
Thank you a lot, Wyatt. I hope people take that to heart. If you haven't organized something in your area, do so. If you go on the UNAC website, unacpeace.org, there's places where you can list your action. We will list them all. We'll be sending out stuff. And you can also endorse the other actions around the country at whatever level. This is what we want to do now. So I'm going to introduce Scott Ritter now. Many times in the past, we've talked about, and you could find it on the UNAC website, the causes of this war in Ukraine. And I don't want to spend a lot of time reiterating them, but we all know of NATO's moves to the border of Russia, even though it said that it would not, the war games on the borders, the nuclear-capable missiles that have been put there, the coup that took place in 2014 that brought real right-wingers, Nazis, people that have swastikas on their jackets. I've seen them march through the streets with torchlights. I've seen them into the government and into the military. The U.S. and NATO helped build up the military from a small military to perhaps one of the strongest in the world. They've armed them, they've trained them, they've attacked the areas that rejected the coup in Donbass and called themselves independent areas. They've attacked them, killing maybe 14,000 people in the last 8 years. And then they started moving again in large numbers and massing on the border of Donbass, and that started the war that we see now and prompted Russia to come in to protect the Russian ethnic people and the Russian-speaking people, to try to disarm this threat on their border and NATO's threat. I'm going to leave it at that without going into a lot of detail and ask some questions for Scott. When events are coming to a head, things happen very quickly. And things have happened very quickly in the past few days and weeks in Ukraine. Typically, when we do these things, we talk a little bit about the military situation in Ukraine, but that's almost the least of the situations right now, although we do want to talk about that, and we'll start with that. But the partial mobilization, the referenda that have taken place, the recent sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines and the meaning of that, the threats of nuclear war that we've been hearing, the economic fallout, especially in Europe, where I am right now, that is taking place. Recently, in the last couple of days, there's been attacks as caravans of cars have been trying to go back to get into the new part of Russia that had the referendums. They've been attacked. The US media says it's Russia attacking these people, but it's not. It's the Ukraine, just as it was Ukraine that's been attacking a nuclear power plant, and it's the West that has attacked the pipelines. So let's start with some questions for Scott, and let him fill them out. Let's start with the military situation, if you don't mind, Scott. There's been a lot of talk about the gains of Ukraine in the Kharkiv region. In the last couple of days, they've been saying things about Lyman. And so what is the actual situation? I know this is something you follow. Maybe you can explain a little bit to us, and then we can get onto some of those other topics.
Sure. I think in order to understand the present, I have to give a quick, just a sketch of the military reality. Let's start off by acknowledging from the start that Russia did not declare war on Ukraine. Had Russia declared war on Ukraine, this war would be over. Russia would have gone in doctrinally with forces appropriate to the task of conquering a nation. This was a special military operation that had as its singular focus of effort the liberation of Donbass, two newly independent republics who had joined in a collective security agreement with Russia, and Russia was intervening on their behalf, citing Article 51, preemptive collective self-defense to eliminate an imminent threat posed by 60,000 Ukrainian troops that had been armed by NATO, trained by NATO, and dispatched to eastern Ukraine for the purpose of launching an offensive against Donbass to conquer it. And the reason why I have to bring this up is there seems to be some expectations in the West about Russian capabilities, and that Russia hasn't lived up to these expectations, and therefore Russia is somehow a paper tiger. The Russian military is not as capable as people thought it would be. An analogy I like to use that maybe people can understand is a boxing analogy. If you're training for a prize fight and you train, in a stance that's left foot forward, so that you're jabbing with your left and then you're punching with your right, and you train your whole time for that, and then at the last second you decide, when you jump into the ring, I'm going to go right foot forward, jab with my right, punch with my left. You've literally taken yourself out of the fight. You're not really fighting. This was what Russia did. Russia did not come in first of all, they never applied the full force of their doctrine. They never organized for this fight in accordance with doctrine. This was a special military operation with very limited objectives and limited application of power. That doesn't mean that the fighting isn't bloody. That doesn't mean that the Russians haven't suffered setbacks. It doesn't mean that the Ukrainians haven't been slaughtered. They have. The death toll in this fighting has been unreal. But I'm here to tell you that modern large-scale ground combat, had the Russians brought to bear the totality of their conventional capabilities, the death toll would be much, much, much higher. Russia organized to fight Ukraine. Ukraine had a very considerable military force, 260,000 active duty forces, several 100,000 reservists. By early summer, Russia had destroyed the Ukrainian military. All of the Soviet era equipment that the Ukrainians possessed at the start of this war, for the most part, was gone. Their military, 260,000 active duty forces, had suffered over 60,000 dead, over 40,000 wounded. And let's talk about that for a second. Normally, you'd expect to see 2 or 3 times the number wounded than you see dead. Why is it that the Ukrainians are suffering more dead than wounded? 2 things. One, the absolute lethality of the modern battlefield. The Russians do have technology that is extremely lethal. Two, the Ukrainians have lost control of the battlefield. They basically are abandoning people on the battlefield who otherwise would have a chance to live, who could be evacuated and provided with medical assistance. These people are being left on the battlefield. They're dying. In war, we talk about the golden hour. In the United States, that's a big deal. If you get wounded badly, we have the golden hour to medevac you off the battlefield to a surgical unit to take care of you. Ukrainians are denied this. Their men are dying. But something happened in May. And Joe, I think we talked about this, the decision by NATO to stop sending defensive weaponry, quote unquote, the javelins, the stingers, the light arms, the counter battery radars, and the transition into heavy equipment. The decision by Congress to enact the so-called Lend-Lease legislation, Public Law 117-128, some $43 billion worth of assistance, military and financial, to Ukraine to prop it up and, in effect, together with NATO, to reconstitute the destroyed Ukrainian military. NATO opened up the totality of its space to provide Ukraine with strategic depth that was outside the reach of Russian air power to strike it. So tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops were sent to England, to France, to Germany, and elsewhere to be trained and to be equipped with this NATO equipment. These troops started to move into the battlefield sometime in July, August. They were supplemented with thousands of highly trained, well-organized mercenaries. And on September, they launched a major counteroffensive. They attacked in Kherson. This attack was repulsed. Many people, including myself, believe that this was a diversionary attack designed to fix Russian forces in place and get Russia to commit reserves. Then they attacked with their main attack in Kharkov, where they caught the Russians flat-footed. One of the things that came out of this is that Russia had insufficient resources to the task at hand. That when NATO has poured in nearly $50 billion worth of heavy equipment, they basically changed the game. And that's what we saw in Kharkov. The Russians were forced to withdraw, reconsolidate their defenses, and then reconsider their next moves. The next moves were decisive. One, Putin ordered the partial mobilization of 300,000 Russian reservists. These 300,000 are currently being organized and trained. One can expect them to start to arrive on the battlefield, at least some elements of them in October, the bulk of them by December. And Russia will act accordingly by having these 300,000 troops available to secure the border and to provide strategic depth. Russia will free up around 210,000 frontline combat troops, which it can now organize doctrinally and apply them in combat the way Russia is supposed to fight. This is, Ukraine changed the game. Russia, or altered the game. Russia changed the game altogether. The other thing Russia did was hold referenda in the four territories that they controlled: Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk. And just today, Vladimir Putin signed legislation that formally incorporated these territories into Russia. And by making them Russia, this has changed. Ukraine changed the military aspect of it by taking a Ukrainian army that had been trained and equipped by NATO and transforming it into a NATO army that was manned primarily by Ukrainians. And that's a qualitative, alteration of the battlefield. Russia responded by taking a battlefield that was being fought on Ukrainian soil and transforming it into Russian soil. And anybody who attacks Russia from now on will now open themselves up for the full strength of Russia. Now, some people have speculated that this includes nuclear weapons. It does not. Russian nuclear doctrine under no circumstances allows for the employment of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. There is no scenario where Russian nuclear weapons would be used in Ukraine. The Ukrainian government is trying to scare the world into believing this is what Russia is going to do. Therefore, they're asking for the NATO nuclear umbrella to be extended over Ukraine. They're asking for assistance in developing their own nuclear deterrent. And they're trying to create a nuclear scare in the West, but Russian nuclear weapons will not be used in Ukraine. Russian nuclear weapons could be used if NATO decided to intervene on behalf of Ukraine, to send NATO forces into Ukraine that threatened the security of Mother Russia, of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Lugansk. If NATO forces were to actually penetrate into Russian territory, then Russia would strike with nuclear weapons against NATO. They would strike London, Paris, Berlin, Brussels, but they wouldn't strike Ukraine. This is Russian doctrine. People who study Russian nuclear posture know this. Where we are right now is that Russia has put NATO in what I call the horns of a dilemma. No matter what NATO does right now, they're going to get impaled. There's no right decision for NATO because they've overcommitted to Ukraine. By committing the military resources to the fight, NATO has stripped bare its own arsenal. Nations like Germany, nations like Holland, nations like Canada, even the United States no longer have anything left to give. The United States just passed a $12 billion military support package, but this is to build new weapons that won't be delivered to Ukraine until 2024. There won't be a Ukraine in 2024, but this is where we're at right now. NATO is overcommitted militarily and politically. And Russia, by basically calling their bluff and going all in, now what is NATO to do? And we found out today, Zelensky put in a request for accelerated membership into NATO. And the NATO Secretary General had to stand up and humiliate himself and say, no, we are not going to let you in. The President of the United States had to say, no, we are not going to let you in. Why? Because they know the stakes. They know that the game has changed. They know that it's no longer about Ukraine, that it's about Mother Russia, and they know that there's no chance for Ukraine to emerge from this intact. It's basically they've written off Ukraine. They will continue to supply weapons to Ukraine as they can, but you're going to see the scope and scale of the weapons diminish over time. And I think we're going to see the Russians launch the kind of offensive that most people thought they were going to launch when they started this conflict. I had an interesting interview with a Russian parliamentarian the other day. And when I asked him how far Russia was going to go, he said to the border of Poland, that this won't stop until all of Ukraine is captured. And that because that's what's required now when the Ukrainian military has been converted to a NATO military, and you say that your goal is the demilitarization of all NATO influence in Ukraine, that means you have to destroy the Ukrainian army. When you say denazification, but the Russian government has classified the Zelensky government as a Nazi regime, that means regime change. And the Russians have said they're not deviating one iota from the goals and objectives set. Now, we talked about the military thing, but remember, war is just an extension of politics by other means. This war is much bigger than just the fighting on the ground. This war has an economic dimension and a political dimension. This war wasn't supposed to happen. We being the collective West, were supposed to intimidate Russia, deter Russia by threatening massive sanctions that would cripple the Russian economy. When you deride a nation and say that it's nothing more Russia, is nothing more than a large gas station disguised as a nation. We've heard that term come from Western politicians. Well, okay, but if you're an automobile that needs that gas station to fuel you, you might not want to cut relations with the gas station. And that's what Europe has done.
Scott, I wonder if we could just pick a little bit of some of the things you said, and get back to some more of the things where I think you were going. But you did mention the partial mobilization. Now that is being decried in the West as a kind of defeat, and that people are running from the country because of it. Do you think that shows some weakness? Do you think, do you have any sense of what that means in Russia and how it is going, or do you hear anything other than what people hear in the U.S. and Western propaganda?
Well, first of all, I don't think people in the West understand the Russian reserve system and the concept of mobilization, partial or general. It's not like the West. They don't have full-time reserves that drill every week, every month, and every year, 2 weeks. Their reserve system is basically once you leave the military, you register, and that's it. Sometimes they have a handful of people that serve as cadres of the various reserve units, but it's not like in the West. So when we see the Russians go through this process of calling up people, to us it seems chaotic. To us it seems less than efficient, not nearly as efficient as the American system. But it's not the American system; it's the Russian system. And a key aspect to this, people talk about the number of people who have fled, and there's no doubt that a large number of people have fled to Georgia, Kazakhstan, Armenia, and elsewhere. Russia is not a dictatorship. Everybody talks about Putin as if he's a dictator. It's a democracy. It's not a Western-style Jeffersonian democracy. First of all, it's a democracy that's been under siege from the CIA and MI6, who's been buying off political opponents, and that alone undermines democratic institutions. But it's a democracy nonetheless. And when Putin runs for election, he wins between 60%, 70% of the vote. Dictators usually win 99.99% of the vote. But think about it for a second. If somebody as strong as Putin is only getting 60 or 70% of the vote, that means 30 to 40% of Russia doesn't support him. And of that 30 to 40%, you could probably say 15 to 20% are strongly people who are vehemently opposed to his government and what it's doing. And in a nation of 150 million, if you have 10%, that's 15 million. If you have 20%, that's 30 million people who are opposed to Putin. So we have 30 million people who are strongly opposed to Putin, and they're saying about 220,000 people have fled Russia. I think statistically we have to acknowledge that that is nothing. That is a drop in the bucket, and it's meaningless. And frankly, most Russians right now look at those people and bid them a fond farewell. What's happening right now in Russia is a mobilization not of just 300,000 people, it's a mobilization of the nation. There is an awakening of patriotism inside Russia today that hasn't been seen since the Great Patriotic War. We are seeing entire towns, villages coming out and bidding their men farewell, sending them off to battle, wishing them to come home and victorious. Mothers are sending their sons, wives are sending their husbands. This is, it's something that we haven't experienced here in the United States. We haven't experienced anything like it. We don't understand it. Is this a sign of weakness? Oh no, this is a sign of Russia's strength. And the world needs to understand that what's about to happen is that Russia is mobilizing the nation. The nation is now committed not just to a special military operation, but to total victory over Ukraine.
Yeah, in the United States, you don't see that. Got to go to the Telegram channels or some of the other Russian media that's been censored here, and you start seeing how the people cheering people when they're leaving on the buses and so forth. You don't see any of that. And to put it in a little context, when we fought the Iraq War, we had reservists too. We had National Guard, we had Reserve Army, we had our reservists going in there. And I am someone who was an anti-war activist during the Vietnam War. I remember the people that tried to get out of the draft during the Vietnam War. 30,000 of them went to Canada. But most of the people that tried to get out of the draft or resisted the draft didn't go to Canada. A lot stayed, a lot fought it, a lot went to jail. They jailed people for up to 5 years who are trying to avoid the draft. And millions of us were in the streets protesting that war. It's so hypocritical to see the Western media, with none of that in its memory and criticizing what's going on there.
Well, let me just say one more thing about the people leaving. The vast majority of the people leaving are not subjected to recall. These are people who didn't serve in the military. These are people who don't have the skill sets required. These are simply anti-Putin activists who are either trying to make a political point or are concerned about a potential future mobilization. But the reality is, this isn't like during Vietnam when somebody got their draft notice and said, I'm going to dodge the draft, or that's what we call it, draft dodgers. These aren't draft dodgers. These are just cowards. I don't mean that. You know, a draft dodger at least had their own form of courage. They were making a moral stance. They were taking great risks. They put themselves at risk of imprisonment, of losing their family, etc. The people that are running away right now are risking. They're literally running away from nothing. Nobody's trying to bring them into the military. Nobody's trying to do anything. They aren't receiving notices. The people who are receiving the notices are almost all going to the mobilization centers. And it's not just that. The mobilization centers are overwhelmed by people who didn't get notices, who said, hey, I just got out of the military last year. Where's my notice? Why aren't you sending me? And they're overwhelmed by these numbers. And you know, so they're actually seeking additional funding to accommodate these volunteers. So we don't understand what's going on. Again, I don't mean to denigrate anybody who has a moral, you know, who morally is opposed to war. I respect that. I wish more people were morally opposed to war. But you know, the people that are fleeing Russia right now aren't anti-war activists. They're basically pro-Western liberals who are angry with Putin and are frustrated with this and are leaving for a political statement. This isn't about running away because they don't want to be drafted. They're not going to be drafted. No one's trying to draft them. They're running away because they have a problem with Putin. And again, that reflects the democratic nature of Russia, that there is a viable opposition. But when you run away, you sort of run away from participatory politics as well. And I think these people are neutralizing themselves in the future, because the Russia they're going to return to, if they ever are allowed to return, is not going to be very sympathetic.
Let me ask you another thing. You raised the question again of nuclear war, which is being circulated here as if Putin had threatened nuclear war, but nothing is further from the truth. I mean, I listened to every word of his speech a couple of times, actually. And what he did say is, if others are threatening us with nuclear war, you must understand that we have nuclear weapons too, and we will respond. Yeah. But taking that, they turn it on its head and say that he's threatening. Now, I'm in Britain right now, and we all should know that the present Prime Minister of Britain is a woman named Liz Truss, and she has threatened nuclear war against Russia. She was asked specifically if she would be willing to push the button for nuclear war, and she said yes, she would. And the commentator was so taken back that he had to ask her again. So she emphatically said, yes, I would. And what Russia has been saying, and now even what the US government has been saying, is they've been giving private warnings to Russia, as well as now a few public warnings. And so this is very clearly what Russia has been responding to, but they turn it on its head and say it is Russia that is threatening.
But
is that your understanding also?
No, it is. But let me go a little bit further on this and talk about just how dangerous these warnings are. Not because they're warnings, but the nature of the warnings. Both Russia and the United States have published their nuclear posture. And Russia is adamant. There's only two circumstances under which they would ever use nuclear weapons. First is if they are being attacked with nuclear weapons, they were responding. The second is if the security of the state is put at risk. That is, if somebody's attacking the state itself, then and attacking it in a way that causes Russia perhaps to lose something like Kherson or Zaporizhia, then Russia could use nuclear weapons to resolve that situation. The West is under the impression that Russia is considering the use of tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And every Russian I've ever spoken to has just said, that's just ridiculous. We would never use nuclear weapons against Ukraine. There's no reason for us to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine. But here's the deal. Because the West is considering it, the West is coming back to Russia. And the warnings that are being given by Jake Sullivan and Biden and company, they, according to Newsweek and other sources, this isn't a threat that if you use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, we will hit you with nuclear weapons. See, that would give Ukraine the equivalent of a nuclear umbrella. And nobody's going to extend a nuclear umbrella to Ukraine. What we're saying is, if you attack Ukraine with nuclear weapons, we will hit you in a non-nuclear fashion that will result in catastrophic losses for you, meaning you will lose the Black Sea Fleet, you will lose the bridge over Kherson, connecting Kerch with southern Russia. We would attack Kremlin. There's even talk about a decapitation attack against Putin himself. I mean, don't they understand what that would be? But so they've said that. But here's the danger. Rather than scaring the Russians, this has actually engendered a debate inside Russia where they're saying the West is afraid to use nuclear weapons against us because of our strategic nuclear capability. Even, and the Russians have extended that, saying, well, then maybe we could strike NATO with nuclear weapons, and the United States won't use its strategic nuclear power to react. So the Russian, first of all, there's a big misread on the part of the West, but now there's a misread on the part of Russia. And both sides are misrepresenting doctrine, misunderstanding the doctrine. And with these high tensions, you never know what could happen. If you had asked me last night, I would have said that we are marching straight to hell, that we're going to hit the nuclear abyss sooner rather than later. Having watched NATO back down, I'm a little bit more relaxed because I was concerned that NATO might overreact to the annexation or absorption of those 4 territories into Russia. But it's clear NATO doesn't have the stomach for this. Stoltenberg said, we are not going to bring Ukraine into NATO. And basically, we're not sending NATO troops into Ukraine. So I think we can avoid the issue of, the Russian nuclear doctrine being tested by NATO threatening the security of Mother Russia. But nonetheless, we have both sides misunderstanding one another because, one, we've introduced nuclear weapons into the discussion. What happened to that statement that was signed earlier in the year by all 5 permanent nuclear powers that nuclear war cannot be won, therefore it should never be fought? That seemed to be thrown away instantly by both the United States and, to a lesser extent, Russia. Mainly Russia reacting to the overreaction of the West for Russia simply stating its doctrine. But it's a very, very dangerous situation, and it's going to be tested more because I believe that Russia is on the cusp of finishing this fight. And they're going to finish it dramatically, they're going to finish it decisively, and they're going to finish it in a manner which eliminates Ukraine as a viable nation state. How will NATO respond to that is the big question. I think the answer is they've got nothing, because literally NATO has nothing, but one never knows. So we still live with the threat of a potential of this conflict spinning out of control and going nuclear.
Yeah, well, I hope you're right. I hope we all hope, the world hopes that there's no nuclear conflagration, but I've lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I remember that. And to me, it seems like we are in a more dangerous position right now than we were even back then. But let's go on to, you mentioned the referenda. Let's go on to the referenda. 4 sections of Ukraine are now part of Russia. I mean, I think there's some technical stuff that has to be voted on by the lawmakers in Russia and so forth. But it's pretty clear that that's where it is. We're also seeing a very interesting phenomenon. Actually, we've been seeing it for a little while. It seems that there are a number of people from the Ukraine side of this fight who are going over to the new Russian territory. I mean, even CNN News did a broadcast about this a couple of weeks ago. I have it on my Facebook page if people would like to see that, where they saw these large caravans of cars going over to the Russian side. And they tried to interview people, and they said, "Oh, well, I'm just going to take someone back." But they all had bags on top of their cars, and their cars were filled with all their belongings. But now 2 of these caravans in the last 2 days apparently have been bombed, going back to Russia. People seem to, that's where they want to be right now. Of course, they blamed it on Russia, which is as stupid as blaming, they bomb the people that are coming to their side. just like they would bomb the nuclear power plant that they control, or bomb their own uh, uh, sabotage their own pipeline. It doesn't make any sense. We've learned through this propaganda regime in the United States and Europe to stand logic on its head, to just say things that don't make any sense. But what about these referenda? Were they real? Was it a smart move on the part of Russia? Where does it leave things in terms of the military situation and the general political situation right now?
I mean, the first question is, were they real? Yes, they're real. They're real. They're as real as it gets. They happened. Do they meet all of the criteria set forth under international law for self-determination? Well, one of the big problems is that they're being conducted during a time of conflict, and one could make the argument that the side that occupies the territory has the advantage. That and you could say this in Kherson. Kherson, 87% of the population participated in the or voted in favor of the 87% of the people voted in favor of this. But that tells you that 13% of the people who voted against. And I would imagine that if all of the residents of Kherson, the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who fled, had a chance to participate, that the numbers wouldn't be quite as impressive. So, there is a case to be made that the legitimacy of these referenda were hindered by the war. And I agree with that, but understand that the reason why these referenda were held is because of the war. That the Russia was changing the game. NATO intervened on the side of Ukraine, transforming Ukraine into a proxy of NATO and changing the nature of the conflict. And Russia, in order to respond to that, needed to change the entire game, and they did so by turning Ukrainian territory into mother Russia. These territories are part of Russia now. Once the Duma votes on it, turns it over to the Federal Assembly, and they send it back to the president, this will be permanent forever. They're never going back to Ukraine ever, ever, ever again. So that makes it about as real as it gets. I think Ukraine needs to wake up. They lost 20% of their territory. If this war continues, I can pretty much guarantee there's 4 more Ukrainian oblasts or provinces that'll go over to Russia. Odessa, Nikolaev, Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkov will all have majority Russian populations, and they will be absorbed. So that's the end of the conflict. Russia is not just taking 20% right now. When this is done, they'll end up taking closer to 40% of Ukrainian territory and call it Novaya Russia, and it'll be Russian. Why are these refugees coming to Russia? There's a couple reasons. One, many of them have pro-Russian sympathies, and they're actually fleeing for their lives. Some, when the Ukrainians retook Izium, a major city in the Kharkov area that had been under Russian occupation since virtually the beginning of the special military operation, they had people went around and painted Z's on the houses of people that were deemed to be Russian collaborators, and then the Russian security or the Ukrainian security forces came in, and horrific crimes have been committed. People have been pulled out, shot on the spot, taken out in the woods, shot, arrested, tortured, etc. And people just don't want to live under that fear, and so people are fleeing that. The other thing is the Ukrainian government is increasingly dysfunctional, meaning that pensions aren't being paid, gas lines are being shut off. There's no power, there's no running water, there's no this. And these people want to go to the territories where the Russians are actually taking care of people. When the Russians occupy a territory, they come in and they bring it under Russian administration, which means now they make available health care, they make available pension plans, they bring in banking institutions, they try to bring running water, gas, everything, and lock it into the Russian system. And there's a lot of people looking around in Ukraine going, this is a hellhole. Over there, life is better. And if you're a father and a mother with kids, do you really want to leave your family here, or are you going to flee to a better life? And yes, life in Russia is a better life by an order of magnitude over the life that's in Ukraine. So these people are fleeing for any number of reasons, but they're fleeing for real. And it's an embarrassment to the Ukrainian government, which is why the Ukrainian military is shelling them in an effort to deter this kind of flight. But it's real. It's a huge moment in Russia. You won't, there's not a Russian today who wasn't in tears over what happened. I mean, again, we in the West don't understand it, but the territories that have been incorporated have always been in the minds and the psyche of the Russian people, Russia, part of the Russian nation. The Donbass, isn't Ukrainian, it's Russian. And the people who live there view themselves as Russia, and the Russians view them as Russia. The same thing with Kherson, Zaporizhia. And when Putin says welcome home, he means it, and it impacts them. And again, in the West, we don't get it. We don't understand what's going on. This is a deeply emotional moment for Russians, hugely emotional. These referenda are as real as it gets. They're irreversible. We can sit here in the West and say, we will never recognize. Russia doesn't care. I would also say that I think the Western opinion on these referenda might change over the course of the winter time when their society collapses. And one of the conditions of Russia providing, future potential energy to help the rebirth of Europe is recognition of Crimea and the territories that have been absorbed. I mean, it's sad. It's sad to see a nation be torn apart like Ukraine. It didn't have to happen. We've had this discussion before. This is a war that did not have to happen, and Russia did everything possible to make it not happen. But once it's happened, Russia is going to terminate this conflict on its terms alone. Any notion that there's going to be a negotiated settlement is absurd. It's unconditional surrender. Russia has set the terms. The terms are extreme. Demilitarization, the total annihilation of the Ukrainian military, either by force or voluntary dismantlement, and denazification means regime change. Zelensky and his government are out. The far right-wing parties are out. And a new constitution is written, and a pro-Russian government will be installed.
Yeah, but it also has to be said that Russia has tried several times for negotiations. First of all, before the February conflict, or twice they had accords for stopping the war in Donbass, which Ukraine, and I think under the behest of the West, specifically Britain and the United States, refused to abide by. But even since February, there's been two meetings that perhaps have brought about negotiated deals. One which took place in Belarus, and people thought, well, maybe there was a deal there. And all of a sudden, not only did Ukraine withdraw from anything and withdraw from negotiations, but one of their negotiators found himself dead. They probably did the wrong thing and said, yeah, well, it'll be good to stop this war. And then, of course, the other one in Turkey, which looked like there was some agreements. And again, probably on the behest of the United States and the West, they withdrew from those. So, and again, in his speech, a recent speech, Putin said again, we will negotiate. But I think he does it understanding that the West has no intention of negotiating at this point. And there's only going to be one solution at this particular time. Now, it seems this explosion of the Nord Stream pipeline has escalated this war to a new and dangerous level. Do you have any thoughts on that? Of course, it's being said that Russia did it. It's like Russia blew up its own property and its own future possibility of making money by selling its gas. It shot itself in its foot again, I guess, just because they're evil people that do things like that. I don't know, but that's what they try. What's your thoughts on what happened there?
Well, let's start first and foremost with first principles. Russia is the largest exporter of energy in the world. It has an extremely well-developed oil and gas industry, both in terms of the extraction and then the shipment. The pipelines are their thing. It's their lifeline. It's their, that's their lifeblood. Nations that invest heavily into energy. They have an appreciation for energy security, and an aspect of energy security is that you do not engage in actions that destroy infrastructure, because infrastructure is very expensive. And this is just a given that you avoid anything that results in destroyed pipelines and things of that nature. So the idea that the world's largest producer of energy, who is tied to the European market, even though Europe is sanctioned, it wants to get back to it. That Russia would shoot itself in the foot by blowing up its own infrastructure is an absurdity in extreme. It's just stupid. Moreover, we don't have Vladimir Putin committing to a statement on national TV that if X and X happens, Nord Stream 2 will be shut down. It'll go away. Trying to kick this dog into submission, but it's not working. But the fact is, we do have President Biden. The United States has been trying to shut down Nord Stream 2 for forever, since its inception. And Biden made the specific threat: if Russian tanks cross into Ukraine, Nord Stream 2 will go away, be shut down. I think we have to take him at his word. And there's other, there's other circumstantial evidence behind this. Large-scale U.S. naval exercises in the exact vicinity of the attacks in July. In September, early September, we had U.S. Helicopters flying over the exact same area. A lot of U.S. military attention and interest in this specific zone where these explosions took place. Now, this is part and parcel of, America has a policy of divorcing Germany and Europe from Russian gas. That's been our policy since the Cold War. And we attempted to achieve this policy by this massive sanctioning of Russia that took place after the Russians initiated their special military operation. And the problem is it didn't work. It backfired on Europe, all of Europe. I mean, you're there, you're seeing it firsthand. It's just the absolute devastation that's taking place, and it's only going to get worse. In Germany, the German government of Scholz, committed to supporting the American policy, not only in sanctioning Russia, but shutting down Nord Stream 2 initially, and then, participating in sanctions that led to the shutting down of Nord Stream 1 through a lack of maintenance. The German people were in the streets last week. They were in the streets and in large numbers, and they were demanding that Nord Stream 2 be opened up. They were demanding it. They were telling their government, we demand that you do this. And it's not even cold yet. So these demonstrations were going to get out of control. This is why the Germans are talking about deploying the military to the streets in October. I mean, Germany's going to put their troops in the streets because they fear mass protest because of the implications of these sanctions. I oftentimes wonder if the Germans have read, Nicholas and Alexandra and understand what happens when you put troops in the streets against hungry people. It tends to backfire. But be that as may, I think the United States panicked. I think the United States is panicking. We being America, our government is looking at Europe and understanding that we're losing control of this situation, that because of the sanctions, Europe is falling apart. Italy is peeling off. I mean, Giorgina Molini, I can't pronounce her name, but she's making some very bold statements about the future of the EU and the role that Italy is going to play and not play. And she's going to be under even more pressure to continue this kind of divorce from the EU as her economy is impacted by these sanctions and the energy. All of Europe is falling. Germany is very much at risk. And so the United States, I believe, decided to take Nord Stream 2 off the table, to remove it as an option for the German government, as a way of basically saying, Germany, you have no choice but to stay the course. We're not giving you an off-ramp. There is no off-ramp. One of the most short-sighted decisions ever made. If it turns out that the United States did this, I strongly believe they did, and it can be demonstrated the United States did this, we literally just lost Europe. We just lost Europe. Decades, 8 decades of European-U.S. relations that have been developing since the end of the Second World War. And it's a relationship that's totally one-sided. I think anybody who studies it understands what the G7, what the European Union, and what NATO are. They are extensions of American foreign and national security policy. They're tools of American policy, but there's a pretense of friendship, a pretense of an alliance there. That pretense is going to be eliminated because Europe is going to wake up, and I believe Europe is already waking up to the reality that the United States doesn't care about Europe at all. None, zero. Why else would we do this to the Germans, our ostensible allies? We blow up a $12 billion piece of infrastructure that is, even though it's majority owned by Gazprom, 49% of it's owned by a European conglomerate. It provides Germany's economic potential. We literally have condemned Germany to go from being Europe's #1 economy to being on the bottom third. By the time this winter is done, Germany will have collapsed. It will not be the power that it was, and it's not going to resurrect because where are they going to get their gas? From the United States that's going to sell them liquid natural gas at what price? Are we going to be good friends and sell it to them cheap? Are we going to match the Russian price? Or are we going to sit there and say, this is good for American business. Pour it on, baby. Charge them triple. Charge them the going rate. Don't blame us. It's the market. The United States has been exposed. And this is, I think, the consequence of this. This is going to go down in history as one of those pivotal moments where basically the veil was ripped from the eyes of Europe. And they suddenly realized that the person they thought was a friend wasn't. Actually, worse than that, they were an enemy, and they've been an enemy all along.
Yeah, I got to agree. As I said, I'm in Britain now. I've been here for the last few months. I'll be coming back to the United States next week, a few days actually. And it's amazing to watch the destruction of the British economy here. In fact, I wrote a long piece about it on my Facebook page if folks want to go there and take a look. But the prices for energy, if they let the market determine what it would be about 5 times as high as it was last year. So they put a cap on it. And the cap is just for 6 months, then they're going to take it off, or they're going to have to make it some other kind of cap. But the cap still caps it at 2.5 times what the energy costs were last year. This is at the same time that there's rampant inflation. I mean, if you sanction a country that provides a lot of the energy for Europe, energy prices go up. If you sanction a country that provides a lot of the grain and food and fertilizer, food prices go up. And not just that, when energy goes up, transportation goes up, the cost for industry goes up, they're less competitive. So there's a recession at the same time. In Britain right now, there is a recession, and so, plus there's double-digit inflation. And people are seriously worried about how they're going to get through the winter. Are they going to be able to heat? Are they going to be able to eat? What are they going to be able to do? I was listening today about a story about kids who are staying out of school. Part of the reason that they mentioned was that they can't afford the bus fare to get to school. I mean, the economy is going in a terrible way. And what does Liz Truss do in the conservative government here? They give tax breaks, which greatly favor the rich. And how are they going to pay for the tax breaks? Some people said, well, you should tax the windfall profits of the energy companies because they're making windfall profits. And so are also the military companies. They're making windfall profits. You should tax the windfall profits to pay for it. But they say, of course, no, they're borrowing money. And the IMF looked at what's going on and saying, well, how are you going to pay this back? You don't have a scheme to do it. And the IMF publicly criticize them. They never publicly criticize an advanced capitalist country. They criticize the global South. And as a result, the pound went way down compared to the dollar. And since the dollar is used for trade and the dollar is used especially for trade and energy, it means all of that goes higher and inflation goes higher. So they're in a terrible situation right here. And it's no different than in other places. You're talking about Germany and other places. We're going to see the same kind of thing. How they're going to get out of it, I don't know. They believe somehow they're going to continue to sanction Russia, and that's going to cause Russia to collapse, and everything is going to go their way. But they now have destroyed the pipeline that could give them the gas that they need. So I think there's a very bad situation that people are going to see in the next several months, and how that's all going to work out politically in terms of the imperialist role of the United States, especially with China growing to a bigger economy, perhaps even bigger than the United States, with Russia, the largest landmass in the world, with a lot of resources and minerals. What is going to happen? And Russia is turning its back now to the West because of these attacks, and is looking towards the East. So we're going to see a difficult time for the people in the West, including ourselves, I think. But we're going to get through this period somehow, and hopefully we'll see a world with a weakened imperialist U.S., and that I think will be in the long run be better for everyone. So let me just end with this. Scott, you're mentioning some of the other areas that might go towards Russia. I was in not too long ago into Odessa right before, into 2019, and I saw the Russian population there. We were there as observers on the Memorial Day when the Nazis had killed all the people at the House of Trade Unions. And thousands of people paraded through all day and left flowers. And then at one point, the families of the people that were killed were going to speak, but the police wouldn't let them use the sound system. But Nazis mobilized from throughout Ukraine, and they tried to intimidate them. And they, at night, marched through the streets with torch lights, and they themselves held a rally, which the police did let them use their sound system for. We witnessed this, but the woman that helped us come there, she was put on a Nazi website, and she couldn't stay. She had to leave the country because she was fearful. And really hundreds of thousands left the country for just these reasons, mostly going to Russia, but it was never said during this whole period, especially since 2014. And one of the other people that spoke to us about what happened was a survivor of what happened at the House of Trade Unions, where the Nazis killed about 50 people and wounded hundreds. And since then, he's been picked up by the Nazis, and nobody knows what's happened to him, where he's arrested. We saw a picture of him being picked up. We can't even find out his whereabouts. And this seems to be happening with many, many people. But you yourself has been put on a list. And my good friend, Ava Bartlett, was put on such a list. She's a Canadian journalist who's now in the Donbass and has been interviewing people. You got to listen to her interviews because you won't hear it in the West. She talks to people about what they think about this and what they think about going back to Russia and the referendum and why they're doing it. And it's things you won't hear in the Western media. But she also has been put on a list. You could listen to some of that on my Facebook page if folks want to go there. So what do you think about this? First of all, are you concerned about you being on this list? What does it mean? Why isn't the United States standing up for you as an American citizen? Why isn't Canada standing up for Ava Bartlett? Why is Britain sanctioning its own journalists who have gone to Donbass just to cover what's really happening there because they don't want it to be covered? So what's your thoughts on this threats and this activity?
Well, this isn't my first rodeo. I was put on the receiving end of U.S. government anger when I spoke out about Iraq and weapons of mass destruction. So I fully know what it's like when truth has been deemed to be the enemy, and that was the case in the lead up to the war in Iraq, and it's the situation today. Truth is the enemy. People, the situation between Russia and Ukraine, and Russia and the West is a very complicated situation. I happen to believe that Russia's on the right side of history, but I'm willing to respect anybody who disagrees. I'm willing to engage in a informed civil debate, dialogue, and discussion, because there might be things out there that I'm not aware of. There might be perspectives that need to be heard. And that's all I'm trying to do. You know, you're not going to see me shouting anybody down, trying to shut anybody up. I simply have my positions. Some are very strongly held, but they're positions that I tend to believe are fact-based. But right now they run counter to the narrative being pushed by the U.S. government. Now, this is more than just the United States simply trying to silence. You know, Twitter banned me. Twitter banned me because Twitter's under pressure from the U.S. Congress. Some people said, well, you should sue. This is a First Amendment thing. You can make a case that Congress has put pressure on Twitter to de facto get around First Amendment restrictions and prevent Congress from passing laws that abridge free speech. That's a complicated legal process. I don't have the time, the money to do something like that. But now we have this situation where the Ukrainian government has published a list. It's put out by the Center for Countering Disinformation. This list was promulgated on July 14th. I'm featured on this list. The people on this list are labeled not just Russian propagandists. And right off the bat, in the United States, I think people need to understand that when you put that term out there and you say you're a Russian propagandist, that has a chilling effect on everything. It immediately denies you access to media outlets because you can't let a Russian propagandist on. It allows you to be shut down on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. But then they go on and they say, no, you're not just a Russian propagandist. You're an information terrorist and a war criminal who deserves to be arrested and prosecuted as such. Okay, that's extreme. But then people say, well, that's just the Ukrainian government. Scott, come on. What are you worried about the Ukrainian government? Except that in May of this year, the United States Congress passed a law, Public Law 117-128, that funds this very center. The salaries of the people in this center are paid for by the U.S. taxpayer dollars. And now, it's when they held this meeting on July 14th, the meeting was organized by a non-government organization funded by Congress, the U.S. Congress, and it was attended by the United States State Department, who gave the green light to this list. So now what we have is the U.S. Congress funding by passing a law which funds a Center for Disarmament or for countering disinformation that labels Americans as information terrorists, and this is being done in concert with the U.S. government. This I have a problem with. This is a frontal assault on the First Amendment. This is Congress passing a law that directly abridges the right to speak. Am I worried about being called a Russian propaganda? Yeah, you know what? Places I used to write for don't publish me anymore because of that. They say, oh, well, you're a Russian propagandist. We can't have you writing for us. It was okay when I was writing something that was the #1 article for the year in terms of clicks for them, but suddenly I'm a Russian propagandist. I can't be touched. So there's a chilling effect. It has an economic aspect to it. But then in September, this center met again with the State Department in attendance and supporting all of NATO support. And you ask what Canada's doing about Ms. Bartlett, how we know. The Ukrainians said it's not just that they're an information terrorist. We don't want to focus on the information. We want to focus on the terrorist aspect, and we want everybody on this list to be treated as a terrorist. What does that mean? In America, we hunt down and kill terrorists. Is that what the Ukrainian government's asking for? And the answer is yes, because there's a second list. There's a second list put out by an organization called Mirotvorets, Peacemakers, Mirotvorets. This list has been around since 2014. This is a hit list, an honest to God hit list. The people on this list die. They get murdered. This is serious business. Daria Dugin, the daughter of Alexander Dugin, a Russian philosopher, was killed. And this list put a mark through her face and said liquidated. They reveled the fact that she died. Another person has recently disappeared who's on that list. I'm on that list. Other Americans are on that list. Eva's on that list. This is a hit list. And shortly after that list came out, videos started to appear where masked people are saying, Scott Ritter, we know where you live. Scott Ritter, we're going to kill you. Scott Ritter, we're going to kill your family. Scott Ritter, you can't sleep. When I participate in chats like this, people come into the chat and say, Scott, go boom, boom. Now, do I take that seriously? You're damn right I do. Every morning I go out and I check my car. I used to be a trained counter-terrorist dude, so I know how to do the quick, 360 around the car. But why the hell do I have to do a 360 walk around my car in Del Mar, New York? Why? Why is the U.S. government allowing this? Why hasn't the United States put a bomb on the very center that's targeting Americans? Isn't that what the government's there for, to protect American citizens? If ISIS was doing this, we'd be doing it differently. But no, when the neo-Nazis in Ukraine target Americans, it's okay. And it's not a joke. People die on this list. And people say, well, Scott, Ukraine's thousands of miles away. Stephenville, New York's just 100 miles down the road. What's there? A Bandera monument to Stepan Bandera and four other neo-Nazis who murdered hundreds of thousands of people in World War II. And every summer, these Bandera-worshiping Ukrainian Americans gather there, hold their torchlight ceremonies, wear their Nazi uniforms, sing their songs, glorify Bandera. America is full of people who are indoctrinated with the ideology of Stepan Bandera, and they've been told by the U.S. government that I'm an information terrorist, with an emphasis on the terrorist, and that I should be treated as such. It doesn't take too much imagination to understand that in this day and age of political violence, there's a real possibility that one of these Stepan Bandera worshiping goons will decide to take the law into their own hands, come up to Del Mar, New York, and do what the U.S. government says should be done: kill me. So yeah, I take it very, very seriously. Am I losing sleep over it? Not really. I got a dog that barks whenever a fly buzzes in the house, so he's a pretty good detection system. I've done, I'm not going to say what I've done, but I've done that which is necessary to secure my house and my family. But why in God's name do I have to live like this? Why should anybody have to live like this? And why isn't the U.S. government doing something about it? And more important, why isn't Chuck Schumer doing something about it? Why isn't Kristen Gillibrand doing something about it? Why isn't Paul Tonko doing something about it? I've written them. I've talked to them about this. They're ignoring it. They're ignoring the fact that they voted for a law that funds the Ukrainian government to bypass constitutional restriction on Congress from passing a law that abridges first speech. This is a serious issue. This is a big issue. And to the average American, let me just tell you right now, there before the grace of God goes you. If you can sit there and say, well, this is between Scott and the U.S. government, okay, it is. You're right. It's not your fight, but it is your fight. The Constitution's your fight. Anytime constitutional rights are abridged, it's your fight. The Constitution belongs to we, the people of the United States of America. And if we are willing to step up and defend it, then once they start taking the rights away from one person, they've taken away from all. And all of us are at risk. Maybe not from Ukrainian neo-Nazis who live in New York, but from the U.S. government and from anybody else who will seek to, basically run a frontal assault on the rights that were supposed to be guaranteed under the Constitution.
You're absolutely right, Scott. It is something that should never happen, and it does. And all of us that speak out feel it to some extent. We feel the pressure. Not all of us have been threatened in the way you have, but many of us have, and have had our social media accounts sanctioned in some ways or another. A group, including friends of mine from the African People's Socialist Party, which has a position similar on Ukraine to what you have and to what I have. The leader of that organization, an 80-year-old man and his wife, had their house invaded with stun grenades. They broke through the door. They handcuffed them on the street and arrested them and accused them of being Russian agents. This can happen more and more. We have people like Julian Assange, who is, they want to put him in jail for 150 years. He's been in jail for how long? For what? For telling the truth? Or Daniel Hale, who was, a pilot of drones, and said they kill civilians more than they kill anybody else. And for that, they said he was giving some classified information, so they put him in jail for 4 years. At one point during World War I, the Espionage Act was used to put the entire IWW, International Workers of the World, in jail. The socialist candidate Eugene Debs was put in jail for opposing that war to run. They can do that. And they did it again during the 50s. Many people were put in jail. And there's a statement of the labor movement that an injury to one is an injury to all, and our movement has to live by that. When one of us is threatened, we must consider that we're all threatened. We must come to all of our the defense of anybody that's threatened in any way we can, politically, physically, or any way. And so you have friends, Scott, besides enemies. You have a lot of friends. So I forgot to really give you a good introduction in the beginning, but as people do know, you did speak the truth during the Iraq War as weapons inspector, and said we did not find any weapons of mass destruction, which was used as the excuse for that war, which may have killed 1.5 million people in Iraq and caused 2/5 of the country to become refugees. And once again, you're speaking out and doing that. And you're an author. You've written a lot, and you're saying that some of your writing is being taken away from you because of your accusation. But what I forgot to mention is you have a new book called Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika, Arms Control, and the End of the Soviet Union. You want to just let people know where they can get that book before we end the video?
Sure. Well, I mean, the book is published by Clarity Press, so you can go to the Clarity Press website and get it. You can get it from Barnes and Nobles. You can get it from Amazon. But you know what? If you're in the Albany area or anywhere, go to your local bookstore and ask for the book. That's the best way because of who I am and all that. The book isn't getting the same kind of support from the distributor. The book's in the warehouses. But to get them on the bookshelf, you got to ask for them to be put on the bookshelf. So if you want to support a writer, and this is a very important book about arms control that isn't just a piece of history about the past, the INF Treaty. It's a template for success in the future, because arms control, I believe, is going to be the only way that repairs relations between Russia and the United States and provides a potential diplomatic off-ramp. So this is a template of success. But go to your bookstore and ask your book dealer to bring the book to your bookshelves. And, I encourage people to read the book. I put a lot of time and effort into it. And I think it's, again, an extremely valuable piece of history, but it's also a template of hope. And today we need some hope.
Thank you. Wyatt's still on the line with us, which is great. Wyatt, do you have anything you want to just say before we close?
Well, not really. I guess I'll just reiterate that UNAC has the call to action for October 15th through the 22nd to say no to U.S. wars. And I think for all of the reasons that you and Scott have touched on as it regards Ukraine, but also, again, that, if people are organizing around any of the innumerable other U.S. fueled wars, whether that's Syria, Palestine, Iraq, Somalia, the list goes on, organize an action and get in touch with UNAC.
Thank you. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us tonight. I hope you heard some things that will help you in your fight against war and to bring about a better world. That's what we in UNAC try to do. I really want to thank Scott again. Every time I listen to him, it's pretty amazing. You're an amazing person, Scott, and thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
We'll have the video up, and it should be in 24